Hi. So as Miriam said, gratefully in English, so I now know what you were saying about me. Thank you. I am Scott John Siegel. My talk today is called David versus GoliathVille, a call to arms for indie social game designers. Now, a brief confession. I originally gave this talk at the Montreal International Games Summit in November of last year. The message and learnings are still very relevant in this talk, but at the pace that the social games industry moves, I needed to update a few things. So you're all very fortunate to be getting the updated Swedish edition of my talk, which might help explain the increased number of umlauts and the occasional meatball. Before I begin, I just need to include this little statement in case I go off the rails and say anything weird like the Kinect is just four Wii's duct taped together or anything like that. Now, I'm here today giving this talk because I am a social game designer. I've been working in social games since 2008, which in social media terms was a very, very long time ago, in Facebook's Wild West days, if I may. I started my career at this tiny 70-person company called Zynga, and I'm currently working as a game designer at Playdom, which was actually acquired by the Walt Disney Company late last year. Now, this was originally the slide where I proudly talked about the latest game that I worked on, but I kind of took it out because that's really not the point of my talk. I'm not here to talk about the games I've made or the companies I've worked for. In fact, I'm really not here to talk about any large companies at all. I'm here to talk about the people that are going to help save my industry. Now, when I was originally writing this presentation, I called it Sage Advice for Indie Social Game Designers. But as I was putting it together, I began to like that title less and less. In giving this talk, I didn't want to get up here and talk down to the audience. I don't want to tell anyone here to come work for me or to come work for any of these companies. In fact, what I really want to do is tell everyone here to go work for themselves. The purpose of this talk is to try really, really hard to start something. This talk is a call to arms. What I want to do is to make all of you as excited about social games as I am. And if I can get one person in this audience to go off and make something playful on a social network, then I'll feel like I have succeeded. And I'm really not exaggerating when I say that I want to save my industry. It might not look like the social games industry needs saving, and many people would argue that it's actually doing just fine. But from a creative perspective, social gaming is a little down and out at the moment. And I'm personally very much ready for a renaissance. And I'm challenging everyone here to rethink their assumptions about social gaming. But when I think about where this renaissance can come from, I'm thinking specifically about the indie community. You know, those punk rockers of games, the small, nimble, ad hoc conglomerates of smart thinkers and doers who have become increasingly active over the past few years. And indies represent more than just groundbreaking games in our industry. They represent amazing events like Indiecade and No More Sweden, publications like Matthew Kumar's EXP magazine, and venues like Baby Castle's Arcade in New York City. The indies are really doing amazing things in our industry, and it's time they start taking social games seriously. Because it turns out they actually don't. Right off the bat, let's admit that the independent games community doesn't actually get social games. And as part of not getting social games, they criticize the whole of the industry for the sins of the part. And because they dislike the approach of some of the largest companies in this space and those companies' games, they dismiss the entire thing, writing off this latest corner of the game industry as a bubble, a cash cow, or as at least one Indiecade attendee put it, just plain evil. And the indie community is in some ways reflecting a feeling that is actually percolating around the entire game industry. And as far as I can tell, this sentiment really hit its stride at the 2010 Game Developers Conference in San Francisco. And it kind of came about from the accelerated prominence of social games at this event, with both the Casual Games Summit and the Virtual World Summit at GGC being replaced entirely by the brand new Social Games Summit. And no part of the GDC experience really went untouched by social. So in addition to all the countless sessions and panels devoted to this new and burgeoning genre, a poorly worded acceptance speech given for Farmville at the Game Developers' Choice Awards kind of managed to ignite the indies in outrage. Here, noted game developer Soren Johnson summarizes the speech. He says, Zynga offended the entire independent games community in their acceptance speech for Farmville by defining the Facebook game as just as indie as the rest of them, and then trying to recruit everyone in the audience. And for some people, their message back to Zynga was to learn some fucking tact, pardon my language. And from this point on, the bad blood between indies and the social space kind of really only snowballed. It just got worse and worse. Now, as an employee of Disney, I incidentally work for one of these Goliaths of the industry. I'm definitely no indie, and in talking about indies, I have to admit that I am very much an outsider. But if I'm going to convince anyone in the indie community or anyone who's interested in indie development to value this space, I need to make sure I understand exactly how the indie community feels about my neck of the woods, beyond the forums and the blog posts and the tweets and the tumbles and the flickers. So I asked around, and I got myself a little cadre of indie figures to help me out. I call them my little club of insiders. Now, as a brief aside, there are actually two problems with my group here that I need to call out. The first problem is this is a complete sausage fest, right? I have no representation on this slide from any women indie game developers. And there's a number of reasons why that may be, but I really should have tried harder to include their voice here. Can anyone guess what the second problem is, actually? Anyone? There's no Swedes! I came all this way and still failed to include any Swedish indie voices in my talk. And that's really embarrassing because there are some really great Swedish indie voices out there. And I just ran out of time. But I feel really bad. I hope you'll all forgive me. I mean, I should have at least gotten one person on this panel, right? But anyway, I got these representatives, these male, non-Swedish representatives of the indie gaming scene, and I asked them three simple questions. I asked them to help me, for the purposes of this talk, clearly define indie. And that'll be the last time I air quote in this talk, I promise. I asked them to help me understand the common understood definition of social games. And I asked them to help me better understand why they thought indies hate social games so much. So we started with question one. And the first thing I learned in this little exercise of mine was that indies, it turns out, really don't like when you ask them to put labels on things, especially not themselves. Chris Hecker, co-founder of the Indie Game Jam and now hard at work on Spy Party, called these dumb questions. Thanks, Chris. Phil Fish, co-founder of Polytron and lead designer on Fez, says that he finds the whole question of semantics, of putting titles on things, somewhat contrived. Okay. Jonathan Blow, creator of the Xbox Live Arcade hit Braid, and currently working on The Witness, had a very similar point of view. And thankfully, Genova Chen, co-founder of that game company, developer on Flower, Flow, he took it a little bit easier on me. And he just admitted that indie is kind of a hard word to define, so I appreciate that. Now, a few folks actually took a stab at definition, but it became clear that there's actually two competing ways of looking at the term indie. And as Frank Lance, Chief Creative Officer of Area Code, puts it, there's indie as method, smaller scale, lower budget, smaller teams working outside traditional commercial contexts. But then there's indie as style, which is a reaction to big budget mainstream style. It's simpler, more direct, less polished, often intentionally primitive, crude, confrontational, ironic, self-reflexive. And I like that. That actually really works for me. And fortunately, it kind of works for this talk, too. Because I think whether you're a capital I independent developer or a punk rock indie damn the man kind of guy, the social game space is more valuable to you than you may think. But I guess the larger question here is what I'm really talking about when I say social games, and I do say it a lot in this talk. My insiders were fairly evenly split on this one. Half felt that it was pretty clear that social games, at least right now, refers to games on Facebook or other social networks. John Blow's actual definition was a little more mean-spirited, but we'll give him the podium in a minute. The other half took the term in a bit more of an idealist direction, seeing social games really as being quite literally games that have an emphasis on socially significant interactions. And even here, the camp was split between people who meant this in a purely digital sense, and then those people like Chaim Gingold and Eric Zimmerman, who expanded to include the entire pantheon of digital and non-digital multiplayer games, going back to chess and checkers and all those things. But what most people actually agreed on was that the term is pretty poor, however one interprets it. So I am kind of inclined to agree, I throw those quote marks up in my head every time I use the term social games, not just because they're not social enough, which is the commonly taken stance there, but rather because I don't think the point of social games is actually being social. And besides, there already exists a thing called social games. Eric Zimmerman and Katie Salen, they coined, or rather recoined the term back in 2004 as a descriptor for schoolyard games. Games like Red Rover, 7-Up, Telephone, these kinds of games that we played as children, either in classrooms or out on the concrete, where the interaction between the individual people and the choices made carry sort of significant social weight. At least they did to us when we were, 7 years old. And there are echoes of that in social games, but it's not really the be-all and end-all of what makes these games what they are. No, the only real reason that we call social games is because social network games is kind of a pain to say. It's too many syllables. And ultimately what matters about these games is what they have access to. And what they have access to is a user's social graph, all of their meaningful connections to their friends and the people they know, and they have the platform's communication channels for reaching that user and reaching that user's friends. Now I'll talk about why that's important a little bit later. So the real question now is, why all the hate? Why do those in the indie scene, however you choose to define it, seem to actively avoid and even detest social games? Why has Phil Fish never even played a social game? And Jonathan Blow gives here what's probably the quintessential answer, if you'll allow me to read from the screen. John says, indie game developers generally don't make social games because they tend to actually like games, and they tend to respect their players and want to give the players good experiences. Social game development is generally about the opposites of these things. It should be pretty obvious. Needless to say, I obviously disagree, not just with the statement, but with the suggestion that it's social games themselves that come with expectations of bad user experience and disrespecting the player. It's somewhat tantamount to looking at the iPhone when the App Store first launched, seeing iFart readily at the top of the charts as soon as it was available, and saying the device has no potential because all it can do is make fart apps. And this isn't true, right? The iPhone's a lot more valuable as a platform. It's a fantastic platform. So I get a little hot-headed when people talk like this, and for a very good reason, because if I really haven't made this abundantly clear, I absolutely love social games. And when I talk about my passion for social games, I'm not just talking about a professional passion. I wouldn't work in this space if I didn't care deeply about the direction that it heads in. So the question is, why do I care? Now, for most people who say they love social games, there are a few key talking points. And part one usually comes from just the sheer immensity of the space. Now, these stats here are increasingly outdated, coming from as late as February of last year. But even then, the numbers were impressive. And I don't need to read off these stats to get the point across. There are just lots and lots and lots and lots of people using Facebook and using these social networks every single day. And not just people, but diverse people, people of diversity. And that's very valuable to the game industry as a whole. And looking just at age and gender, you can see a much older and more female representation here than what most of the industry is used to. The one exception to that would probably be the casual games sector. But even these numbers kind of trump that. We just get older women in this space a lot easier than a lot of the industry can. And according to this same study, the average social gamer is actually a 43-year-old woman. So that alone could be your reason to make social games, because there's a very good chance that Nicole Kidman will play them. But of course, the biggest talking point we have is probably the money. There's a lot of it. And at a time when the rest of the industry is finding itself in kind of a hard place financially, more and more big box developers and publishers are starting to get very interested in social gaming as a money-making machine. And since I first wrote this talk, an ever-increasing number of developers and publishers have found their way to social gaming, with more on the way. I made this slide 2 days ago, and I woke up this morning to news that both THQ and Amazon have announced intentions to publish social games. So yeah, that's a thing. So social game is very broad. It reaches diverse demographics. And social game is printing money. when the rest of the industry is struggling to do so. And these are the two reasons that most developers stand up on their soapboxes and shout, "I love social games." But these aren't my reasons. They're neat, but not my reasons. No, the reason I love social games was because back in 2007, when I was still a student, or I guess when I was slightly after being a student, I played a game called Parking Wars. And in 2007, Parking Wars was the first truly great game on a social network. Not the first great social game, it was that too, but it was the first great game on a social network. But let's go back for a brief moment. As Miriam said, in 2005 and 2006, I got my first break in the game industry by interning for a company called Area Code in New York City. And Area Code is by far just one of the savviest game houses in the entire United States. And these were just some of the brilliant people I had the pleasure to work with. I worked with people like Frank Lance, Kevin Slavin, Katie London, Kevin Kansian, and over there on the far left, that's actually Dennis Crowley, who left Area Code to actually go found Foursquare. So these are neat people. Now, a lot has actually changed since I first gave this talk. And early this year, tragically, or not tragically, depending on how you see things, Area Code was actually acquired by Zynga, one of the Goliaths of the space, and is now known as Zynga New York. But as far as I'm concerned, it's always going to be Area Code in my heart. So anyway, back in 2007, Area Code worked in cooperation with the television network A&E to develop a Facebook game for their upcoming reality television show based on the everyday jobs of the Philadelphia Parking Authority. These are the meter maids, the towers, and the booters of the city of Philadelphia. I haven't actually ever seen this show. I should probably watch an episode sometime. But it doesn't really matter, because the game Parking Wars actually doesn't have anything to do with the show Parking Wars beyond the name. It ignores almost every single convention the show has, and I think basically just bases the design purely on the title. And the way it works is that every player in the game is in control of their own street and a small fleet of vehicles. So you got my street, creatively titled Scott Street, and you've got my cute little fleet of vehicles there. And every player in the game takes their cars, and they go to their friends' streets, and they park their cars. And the longer you leave a car parked in a parking spot, the more money that car accrues up to a certain cap. And when you move the car, you bank that money. The catch is that certain spots in the game have parking restrictions on them. Some are for blue cars only or green cars only, and some it's just downright illegal to ever park there. But that's not to say you can't actually park there. You can park in any spot you want, but if a friend catches you parked illegally, she can ticket you, and you lose the amount of money you would have otherwise gained, and your friend gains that money. So with few exceptions, the entirety of the gameplay in Parking Wars takes place in that tension, in that moment. The longer I leave my car illegally parked on Katie's street here, the more money it makes, but the higher chance I have of losing that money if she tickets me. And at the same time, Katie might see me parked there, but she wants to wait as long as possible to ticket me, to maximize the amount of money that she'll make. But if she waits too long, I might move the car. And that's kind of what made Parking Wars work when people were playing it. And it was really fun. It's not perfect, but it did something that I saw very few games doing at that time, that I saw very few games capable of doing. And to talk about that, I need to talk briefly about the Magic Circle. So I'll jump briefly into academia land here. Now, the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga, which if you're a student at this school, I hope you know who Huizinga is. He coined the term magic circle in his text Homo Ludens. It's a sort of groundbreaking text on the role of play in culture. It precedes game design as a field. It precedes this interest that we have in games and ludology and all those great things. But it has since become a cornerstone of academic thinking about games and game design. And what the Magic Circle is, of any game, digital or non-digital, is it's considered to be the space that is created by the rules of the game. I love rules. And this space is occupied by the player during play. And the Magic Circle is kind of a protection of sorts, everything the name implies. It protects the sanctity of play from the harshness of reality. And it's kind of a critical piece of games as a form of escapism. We couldn't escape with games if we didn't have this sense of a magic circle protecting us from what we're escaping from. Now, traditionally, the magic circle is considered a finite space. It exists within the bounds of the start and end of a game, or the bounds of when a player picks up and later puts down that game. But let's look again at Parking Wars. The magic circle is the time in which a player is on Facebook, moving cars and ticketing friends. But when the player walks away, the game is actually still going. The cars are increasing in value, the friends are still parking on this player's street, and everyone, the player included, is trying to decide when the best time to come back into the game is. And that decision of when to log back in, when to re-engage with the game, is as much a part of the game and as much a part of the game's strategy as any moment of gameplay that occurs when you're actually logged in. So how does this get defined in Huizinga's view of the magic circle? You know, it kind of doesn't. You could argue that the magic circle of Parking Wars never closes. Or you could argue that paradoxically, this aspect of the gameplay exists outside of the magic circle. Or you could argue what I argue, that Parking Wars creates magic circles within the heads of anyone who's actively playing the game. And even when you're not playing, you're still playing. Part of you is still engaging with this game. You're making a decision when to log back in, and you're wondering what activity is occurring in the game while you're away. And that's part of that gameplay experience. So this was kind of new. It's not entirely unheard of. You know, the idea of persistent worlds has obviously been around for a very long time. We've got it in MUDs and MOOs and MMOs and other three-letter things that start with M. But what's different here is the weight of the thing. You know, persistence generally implies that the magic circle of the game world is heavier than whatever magic circle might dance around in the player's head. But with Parking Wars, the periods of engagement with the game were actually very tiny. And you almost spend more time thinking about playing the game than you do playing it. And before Parking Wars, there were actually a very small contingent of games that shared this kind of unbalance. One of these games was a game called Skyritz. Skyritz was developed in 2006 out of Carnegie Mellon's Entertainment Technology Center. So this was a student game. Players in Skyritz would fly World War II airplanes around a very large, mostly water-based map. And their goal in doing so was to seek out pieces of land to organize trades of various materials. So it had a little bit of dope wars in there for anyone who's played the old game. But all the flight in Skyritz occurs in real time. So if you set a waypoint, it'll take you X number of hours to actually get to that island, as if you're actually flying the plane. And during flight, players can either log out of the game and just come back when they're done flying, or they can stay there and play and participate in dogfights during the travel period. And the combination of real-time flight and this sort of dope war-style trading mechanic was so compelling that one game developer recently admitted to me to planning parts of her day around her Skyritz flight schedules. Another developer would check up on his flight patterns during meetings. He would just kind of open his laptop and pretend to be working, but secretly be playing Skyritz. Now, this actually should sound kind of familiar. I mean, we could replace aeroplane with the word strawberries, and I might as well be describing Farmville right now. I mean, these same guilty admissions are happening every day on Facebook. And unsurprisingly, the other example of this type of play style, at least that I was able to find, was an earlier area code title called Shark Runners. Now, Shark Runners was developed yet again for a television show, or rather a television station. It was developed as part of the Shark week of shark-based programming on the Discovery Channel. And it has players plotting courses in the ocean in pursuit of sharks for the purposes of research. And again, like Skyritz, the boats would move in real time on the ocean. And when a boat would encounter a shark, the game would actually send a text message to the player telling them to come back to the game, log back in, and resolve this shark encounter. Now, I actually had the pleasure to work on Shark Runners. I wrote a lot of the copy that appears in the game. A fun fact about Shark Runners, all of the names and locations of these sharks are actually based on real-world telemetry data. So players were virtually chasing real sharks in the ocean. Shark Runners also is my first cameo appearance in a game. I appear as Jay, the crew member. For some reason, my favorite fish is a snake. Jay's not very smart. These few examples aside, the callback gameplay style of Parking Wars was pretty new. And this balance of sort of on and off gameplay is what I believe to be the singularly most defining aspect of what we call, I'm going to do it again, I'm sorry, social games. Because social games may be at times social, but that's merely a means to an end as far as I see it. And the reason that social games exist, the reason we've been defining this new type of gameplay, is because of the internet. And they exist because our model of interaction with the internet began to significantly change about 5-6 years ago. To be more accurate, it actually started to shift back in 1999, when RSS, or really simple syndication, began a sort of slow proliferation across the web. It just took until 2005 for RSS to really begin picking up steam. Now, for those who don't know, RSS is a family of standardized formats for publishing regularly updated content on the web. And this standardization allowed for the creation of tools other than web browsers for the digestion of internet information, as well as the remixing of this data in various forms. And RSS is really, really significant from a social media net perspective because it changed the way that people used and thought about the internet. You know, prior to RSS, our relationship to the internet was largely static. There were news sites, but the web was largely devoted to the dissemination of established information. And the notable exception to this was IRC and bulletin board communities, places where new information could flow more freely, but the rest of the internet really lacked the means to have this kind of flexibility of information. But when RSS began to gain widespread acceptance, it was kind of like a dam burst. And with the advent of RSS feeds, formats like blogging started to grow exponentially in popularity. The web shifted to a substantially more dynamic model. And now, less like an ocean of information, the internet became a fast-flowing river. And these were the beginning stages of information compulsion. And information compulsion teaches us that there's constantly something new happening somewhere. And we, as human beings, are compelled to be accessing new information. We're driven forward by a need to learn new things or discover new things, as long as there are things discoverable. And the more points of information that you have when you're seeking out something new, the more likely you are to find something new every time you check. So anyone who, sits in front of a computer and just idly clicks from website to website is familiar with this feeling. You're really just looking for any change from the last time you clicked. And the more points that you have to click, the more likely it is that when you go back to point number 1, something new will be there. And this is the new current model of the internet age. And blogging fed this model first, along with news sites. But it's become more and more widespread with services dedicated to this kind of format, like YouTube, Twitter, Tumblr, and, of course, Facebook. Because as people, we really strive for this information. We're compelled to know more about everything. And a large part of this is escapism. And escapism is a term that's already very familiar to game developers and game enthusiasts alike. Information compulsion is actually a form of escapism. But what social media provides is what I call shallow escapism. Short-form bursts of information. When we're sitting at work, riding a bus, waiting to be seated at a restaurant, or wherever we may be idle, what we seek in those moments is shallow escapism, short-term engagement, though notably often as part of something larger. We might be playing a long-term game, working through a long-term problem, but we're doing it in short, punctuated pieces. And that, I feel, is what social gaming is. Social is indeed a means to an end. The social graph here creates an infrastructure of connected players feeding new information into the world, and combined with the communication channels of that platform, they create entry points throughout the day for a player to re-engage, however briefly, with the magic circle. And so fundamentally, I think this is a new model. We as an industry have spent years building and developing for long-term, single-session engagement. We view games as extended forms of escapism. And here comes this new thing with this built-in, assumed model for something completely different, something short, punctuated, that continues to play out in the head even when the player is not playing. And if you ignore the profit of this space, if you ignore the massive user base, there's actually something kind of cool happening. There's something happening that's kind of a big deal. So my question is, why are so few people seeing it? Why is social games struggling to be seen in this light? Is it because it gets associated with sort of unwashed masses? Is it because Facebook has become passé if you're in the right crowd? Because companies like mine got there first? Because it's become a business before it was able to become anything else? You know, even a noted game academic like Ian Bogost doesn't actually take Facebook's seriously. Ian created a game called Cow Clicker as a satire of what he saw as the mindless player clicking and publisher profiteering that occurs in this space. Now, for anyone not familiar with Cow Clicker, it's a game in which you click a cow. You can click your cow once every 6 hours, which earns you 1 moonie. You can then share your click with your friends, and if they click your click, you both benefit with additional moonie. And you can then spend moonie to purchase new cows. My personal favorite is the Highland Coo, based off the Highland Coo. The ridiculous thing is that without even trying hard, Ian was able to make a moderately successful and compelling game. And at its height, Cow Clicker had around 50,000 people playing it every month. That's 50,000 MAU in social games terms, though it's obviously since declined. But the more remarkable thing is that the metric for measuring player retention has actually remained fairly stable over time. And even as the game declined, there were still a high percentage of players coming back into the game regularly. There was something compelling happening amidst all the satire of this game. You know, I had a writing professor in college who once challenged us to write bad fiction. He wanted us to try to create something terrible. He wanted us to ignore the rules of quality that we set for ourselves and just write without rules or constraints. And the result was actually a little bit here and there, but there were some really interesting things that got generated in that class. Because once we were given permission to write crappily, once we were freed from the constraints and certain expectations of what good writing looks like, we were actually allowed to be playful with writing. And surprise, playful actually works. Now, Ian Bogost is someone who spent his entire career making incredibly earnest games. He's one of the most earnest game designers out there. And the one time he tries to make something intentionally crappy, it gains tens of thousands of players within a month of its uncelebrated release. Cow Clicker is now Ian Bogost's most famous game. And for all the work that he's done for sites like the New York Times, for the game poetry that he's made on the Atari 2600, for the multiple books that he's written on the topic, for his appearances on the Colbert Report, when people meet him, they say, "Oh, you're the Cow Clicker guy." Ian hates this. So, I don't know. I don't know why it's so hard for me and for my industry to get legitimacy. Maybe the indie community has its ironic necktie on a bit too tight. Maybe some of the most playful people in our industry are so busy feeling like they should be opposed to social games and social networks that they're not willing to even try being playful. Alternately, maybe they're just scared. After all, it's one thing to make a game on a social network. But the idea of making a successful game, a game that pays for itself, that makes itself worth the time, one that a hardworking developer that's on a shoestring budget can actually bank on, is another thing entirely. And beyond the challenges of making something unique and innovative in this space, or any space, social game developers have had to deal with what from the outside feels like an incredibly crowded and aggressive marketplace. As the title of my talk suggests, there's this sense that competing on Facebook means competing with the top dogs of the industry. And a lot of developers have shown up to social games with the intention of being one of those top dogs. They issue press releases and plans to overtake the titans of the industry. And it's a very ambitious goal, and nothing is more healthy for an industry than competition. But I have to level with you as an audience, and this is the most harshly honest thing I think I'm going to say during this entire talk. You cannot take down the Goliaths. And there's a couple reasons for this. Much earlier I mentioned the Wild West days of Facebook. And back when Facebook first launched their app development program back in May of 2007, they didn't really know what to expect. And as such, the policies that they formed around this system were very lax. And it took about until 2008 for games to become popular on Facebook. But before that, developers were creating these incredibly spammy apps because they saw the opportunity as ad-driven. They saw that they could get large numbers of impressions on ads and clicks on ads as long as they made apps that just drove a lot of eyeballs to a particular page. This is very similar to, to the old model of the internet as well. I mean, this is the dot-com boom all over again. And as time went on, Facebook updated the policies more and more. They were experimenting with new communication channels. They were shutting down old ones. And by mid-2009, the entire platform kind of locked down, became a lot more strict. And the communication channels became much fewer. So all of a sudden, it wasn't really possible to grow games the same way you used to be able to grow games. But the developers that grew rapidly during that early period still retained all of those traffic and all of those installs. And new players in this space will actually struggle much more to get anywhere approaching the same kind of numbers. And part of the issue is that the whole concept of market share on Facebook, how many users you have, how many daily active users, monthly active users, installs, this whole idea is actually completely based on aggressive ad spend and tightly integrated cross-promotional advertising. So if you got a game that's as big as Farmville and you have another game that you want to make larger, all you have to do is put ads for it on Farmville. Or all you have to do is spend incredible amounts of money to put ads up on Facebook. And you can get clicks into your game, but it's become something other than it's not about true virality anymore. It's about something else. And new developers, new small developers, they can't possibly compete with this. But I guess the question is, why would any new developer in this space really want to? Because aside from the massive costs that get incurred by the kind of ad spend you would need to do, the server costs to maintain a game that has tens of millions of people playing it, tens of millions of people that might not even be dedicated players, might just be checking it out because they clicked an ad, gets really, really expensive. Now, because revenue is an incredibly closely guarded secret in this industry, there's really no data comparing the average revenue of a game that has 200,000 people playing it every day to a game that has 10 million people playing it every day. Which is a shame, because I'd love to throw that slide up, because I got a feeling that the game with 200,000 people still makes quite a bit of money, regardless of not having 10 million people playing it every day. And its server costs are exponentially lower. But this is the data that I do have. Last year, InsideSocialGames.com took a look at some more public metrics surrounding success on Facebook. Using AppData.com, they took a look at the growth trend of the top 20 Facebook games. And this is that graph. And if you look at it, it seems to indicate stagnancy and actually decline in social game growth. And this is showing us the daily active users of these Facebook games. And you see that the number is actually dropping. But this is a cool magic trick. Watch this. That's the same exact data, excluding the top 5 game developers on Facebook. So the most popular developers, the most successful developers, if you remove them from the equation, the line actually starts going up a little bit. I don't get math, so this is really neat to me, because it's just like a magic trick. And I have one last magic to show you. That's the same data again, but this time it's still ignoring any titles from the top 5 game developers, but it's also ignoring the top 50 games on Facebook. These are the top 50 most successful games on Facebook. So everything left over when you remove what we consider to be success is success. How does that work? It's like a paradox. And no single game in this set of data has more people playing it every day than 200,000. And that's not success. By the standards of companies like Zynga and Playdom, a game that has 200,000 people playing it every day is not successful. And so this is what being a little guy on Facebook actually looks like. And that's not that bad. These are companies that are building games you haven't heard of, but they're successful. They're growing, they're making money. And this is what it means to be a David on Facebook, not a Goliath. So I think the best advice that I can give anyone getting into social games is to not compete with the big guys. Instead, what I really want to urge all of you to do is cooperate with the small guys. I want you all to think about making social games. I want you all to work in small teams. I want you all to work fast, and I want you to be flexible. You know, I want people to get into this space because it affords you the ability and the opportunity to build playfully. You can build things quickly. Social games can take 6 months to build, and that's, you know, considered a healthy length for a big developer. And I'm sure you guys can build things faster. I've seen the things you built in 10 weeks, and I can't imagine what you guys could build for Facebook in that time. And don't be afraid to throw out code. Don't be afraid to iterate, to try things over and over again. Don't be afraid to try things that everybody's trying, but don't be afraid to try things that nobody is trying. And test everything. And if you actually release a game on Facebook, you'll make me really happy. But don't go buying ads immediately, if ever. You know, tell your friends and your family to play. Tweet about the game. Tell sites that cover social games. Tell sites that don't cover social games. I can almost guarantee that if an amazing indie game appeared on Facebook, Joystick would cover it, if it was really good. They don't care whether a game's on Facebook or XBLA. If it's a good game, you'll get coverage. You know, and treat your early players like close friends. You know, if you get early players into these games, one of the best things about Facebook is it's a game community service. You do games as services. So go onto your forums, treat your early players like close friends, keep in close contact with these people, and ask what the players want. Ask what they want to see in your game. Form a close relationship. And form a close relationship with other small developers on Facebook. You know, you have to create community around development. You have to encourage open dialogue. Because we're at that time in this part of the industry where we're either going to close down or we're going to open up. And I want to see us open up. If your game actually becomes more popular, if you make something that gains popularity, share that success with your users. Make them invested in your milestones. Create special items to commemorate big events in your games, like your 1 millionth user. Create special items for your earliest players. Make them feel proud for long-term investment in your game experience. And be on the forums and let your fans know that you're real people. Show humility to developers and to players. Just be playful. And the most important thing I think I can suggest is just have fun doing it. You know, if you build for Facebook, know that you're building games in an incredible space, a space that encourages playfulness, and please tell others to do the same. That's all I have. Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, please.